You know what I think is a compelling podcast? It's a podcast that doesn't sound like a podcast. And I know that's a really
Okay.
goofy answer, but if it sounds like two people talking or three people talking and they're having this conversation that there's a genuine back and forth of information, that's what makes the best podcast.
Welcome to Audio Branding, the hidden gem of marketing. Sound plays a more important role in human behavior and our decision-making than you may realize. In this podcast, I'll help you understand the art and science of sound so you can better influence others in business and your life. I'm your host, Jody Krangle. Let's delve a little deeper. This is the second part of my interview with Joe Pardavila. Being nosy, which I think is a good attribute to have as an interviewer. When was there a time where you were nosy and you got an answer that you weren't expecting?
Yeah. Well, this is funny. So we luckily had a lot of celebrities come into the room and talk to us. And I remember one was Chris Martin. And Chris Martin had just divorced Gwyneth Paltrow. And he talked about how he was feeding his kids lunch one day. And he said, my English accent's terrible, but, so I was making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to the kids this morning and blah. And I stopped him. I was like, wait a minute, this is Chris Martin, who was famously married to Gwyneth Paltrow, who anyone knows anything about Goop and her lifestyle brand. It's all about healthy living and everything's got avocado in it, or, everything is super healthy.
He's famous in his own right. So
he's famous in his own right. But in terms of like lifestyle and like what
Yes.
they put in their body, like we know where Gwyneth Paltrow is coming from. So you assume Chris Martin feeding his kids would be the same thing. So I stopped him mid-sentence. I'm like, what do you mean peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Gwyneth Paltrow's kids eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches? And he looked sort of like he was more befuddled than everything else. It was like, yeah, they're kids. They eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And again, that created this sort of like really human moment for people because, the Gwyneth Paltrows and Chris Martins of the world have such an air about them. This sort of like better than everybody else vibe. But to get that out of them that like his kids are just like normal kids is kind of a really cool little side story that really just had nothing to do with anything, but the fact that I was really paying attention to what he was talking about, that he was able to just go into his relationship with his kids and how it could be the spawn of the biggest celebrities on the planet, but they're just like any kids out there.
yeah, kids are kids. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. And nosiness is a big part of it because I feel like when it comes to questions and when you come up with whatever topics you want to discuss on a show, it's like, what's the point? Like if you're not curious about the person and want to know everything you can about them to a certain extent, obviously, what's the point of like having the conversation? Like it just people just going back and forth and just go ahead and do just an hour chat about the weather or the last time they went to Cancun. It's just there's nothing there. It's just really just getting to know the person and getting to know. I don't like to use these kind of phrases, but get to know what makes them tick. Like, let them to know what inspires them. What is their life like? What makes them make the decisions they decide to make? And that's to me the biggest part of being nosy, and whether it's doing a podcast or whether you're bumping into someone on the street, because people love to talk about themselves. I mean, that's one of the things you will come to realize, Jody, and I'm sure you know this from your years of experience. It's like a lot of people like to hear themselves talk, but they need the opportunity. Because they really can't just start talking about themselves in the middle of the street. They may end up with a 5150 hold. But if someone decides to ask them about them, they have an audience. And an audience of one is plenty big for most people.
That's why you go on podcasts.
That's right.
Let me tell you.
That's why I'm here, Jody, just to hear myself talk. Just that.
Well, when we're getting into conversations, just sort of moving on to kind of, I guess, the meat and potatoes, I guess, of the book, which I think will really help a lot of people who are podcasters or on the radio for that matter.
Yeah.
You mentioned 4 ways to ask the right questions in your book. Can you talk a little about that? Just because I thought it was a really important part, and I'd like people to understand a little more about that.
Well, I think what's super important, whether it comes to preparing for a date, job interview, or doing a podcast, preparation is such a big part of like what you're going to be talking about. And I know it can seem silly, but you'll have conversations with people. They'll be like, "Oh man, I'm going to go visit my father-in-law, and I don't know what I'm going to talk about. He's this or that." And I'm like, Yeah, sure. Of course, you may not be the same age, have the same cares, but it's easy to find out about what that person likes to have a conversation about. Your father-in-law might like hunting, or your father-in-law might like golfing. Before you get together with the father-in-law, look up the most recent golf tournament. Find out what's going on in that world. Prepare yourself to be able to give that person the opportunity to share, because more than likely, if he sees like the son-in-law coming in the room and like, here we go, he's just thinking the same thing. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about this person. So I think people have to keep in mind, when you talk to someone about themselves, they also want to talk to you about yourself. And so you have to just reverse engineer that. Like, so if someone was going to talk to me, what would they talk to me about? And just think about it that way. The idea of caring what you're going to talk about goes a long way in every form of life, whether you do it professionally or in your personal life. Just caring enough about another person and their story, that's what makes us all better people. Because once you can understand other people, you can understand where they're coming from. I always, I talk about self-awareness earlier, how I wasn't very self-aware, but like, to me, self-awareness is very important, because if you can put yourself in another person's shoes, you can understand where they're coming from. We live in a very polarized world, Jody. I know you're our neighbor to our north, but here in America, we're pretty polarized people.
Everyone's polarized right now.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
not only an
everyone
American
is.
problem.
But the reason being, Jody, is because we can't put ourselves in the other person's shoes. And just for example, if you're environmentally conscious, you'll see someone driving like this big gas guzzling truck. If you are very judgmental, you may be like, oh, this person just doesn't care about the environment. He probably has guns. He's probably a redneck. He's probably uneducated. So you create this narrative of this person is, but you don't really think about, like, maybe that person when they were 10 years old had a horrible accident and they feel safer in a truck. Like I always used to be like, I used to always judge when I used to see soccer moms in like these giant SUVs, and all you would see, like the old George Carlin line, you should just see Knuckles in the driver's seat. And I would always be like, what's the point of them driving that? And then as I got older, I'm like, well, yeah, because they have kids in the car. They want to feel safe. And so most people would be automatically default to that. Oh, this person just doesn't understand how the climate is just being destroyed by the man, and we're not doing anything about it. So just stepping back and thinking about what that person's possibility or reasoning for doing something, you could apply that to any kind of debate we're having today, whether it's about pro-life or guns or anything like that. Just put yourself in the other person's shoes. And I think if we did more of that, it would be a better place to live. And again, I don't want to create some sort of utopia where everything's perfect and there's no violence. I mean, that'd be cool, but we can at least try to get to know each other better. And that it just means putting yourself in the other person's shoes.
Yeah. So coming up with questions in an interview, do you have like a go-to way that you figure that out? I mean, obviously research is part of that.
Yeah.
But what makes a compelling question?
Yeah. You know what? One thing I really like to do, and I think part of research, is look up old interviews, especially if the person's been doing interviews for a long time, and compare how they answered a question 5 years ago as opposed to today. And I think that's a great way to bridge the gap and give someone sort of like a timeline and be like, hey, you thought like this in 2015, but in 2019 you said this. What brought you there? So it's just looking for patterns and connecting the dots and seeing what can become a compelling conversation. I think looking up old interviews also give you an opportunity to avoid some of the same questions that a person is going. So that's one thing I always like to, not that I'll ever listen to an entirety of an interview. I'll sometimes look at a transcript, or just if they're on, one of the late night talk shows. It gives you the opportunity to avoid the most obvious questions. So you'll see someone do a podcast interview and be like, oh, that person's answered that already, and the answer wasn't all that great. But also the great thing about that, though, Jody, is that if they do have a great answer, your audience is not necessarily going to hear that answer. So it could be something as like, man, I heard you do this interview the other day where you talked about X, Y, and Z. Can you just, is that true? Is that real? Did that really happen? And then all of a sudden your audience will hear this story, and doing it that way also puts you in the clear of like, if the audience did hear it somewhere else, they'll be like, oh, that guy's just stealing another person's question. No, it's like, hey, can you just share that with my audience? because not, as much as we're all egotistical and feel like everyone's going to hear every interview I've ever given in my life, there's a pretty good chance that they're not. Like, that's why you'll see a lot of celebrities when they're doing junkets or doing talk shows. If they're pretty much going to have the same 2 or 3 anecdotes in every interview. But if you know that, that'll also give you a fresh way of looking at the interview. Like, all right, cool. This person is it's always funny when you hear an actor give an interview about like how much weight they lost in a movie. 99% of their interviews will be about, oh yeah, I lost 50 pounds for this film. Knowing that, reverse engineer that. Like, be like, okay, cool. Hey, I heard you lost a lot of weight for this movie. How did that inform your character? Like, instead of it just being like, so does that mean you like ate 1 egg a day? I mean, nobody at that point, they've answered that question 100 times. But if you're able to take that question that's been asked 100 times, do it sideways, as my old boss used to say.
That's a good saying. Yeah.
Yeah. You do it sideways and you can get a different answer out of the person.
I know we're all dealing with a lot these days, so I really wanted to acknowledge those that have gone out of their way to leave an honest review of this podcast. Millie Alto writes, binge-worthy podcast. Great voice with great content makes it a delight to binge listen to and learn what you are missing in your advertising repertoire. They truly are hidden gems of marketing. It could be a whole new paradigm for how you strut your brand. Great point, Millie. I certainly agree that more people should be thinking about the sound that's associated with their brand. I have a whole podcast about it, in fact. Thanks so much for your review. And now back to the show.
Well, I'm going to have to apologize for not being particularly original then here. Yeah. I did want to ask
Jody,
you.
But I will say, in terms of about the asking questions that they've been asked a lot, sometimes those are always good intro questions, like early in the conversation, especially if you do have like 30, 45 minutes to talk to someone. Throw some of those snowballs or softballs out there, and then they'll get loosened up. So I wouldn't say avoid the obvious question, but use them early to get the person loosened up, and then
make them comfortable.
Exactly.
Yeah, because they'll know the answer. Yes.
Exactly. Yes.
Not a problem.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you also about your improv, because I know that you did a lot of that. So why did you decide that you wanted to do improv? You thought that would help with your radio career, or did it help with podcasting?
Well, it's funny. It ended up helping my career and life, and I didn't realize it was going to. So I was always a fan of Saturday Night Live. I grew up with the 80s cast of like Eddie Murphy and Joe Piscopo and the Billy Crystals of the world.
Yep.
And so I loved Saturday Night Live, but the idea of doing something like it seemed foreign to me. Like, I wouldn't even know how to do it. But in New York City, the rise of improv and sketch just exploded over the last, say, 20 years, when Amy Poehler and a couple of guys from Chicago started what was called the Upright Citizens Brigade, which is this huge improv group that just took over the improv. I mean, they were the Beatles of improv comedy. And so they started a school and a theater in New York where they taught people how to do long form improvisation. And I was at the point in my career in radio where, what I mentioned earlier, you just didn't have any time to like self-improvement. Like, I couldn't read a lot of books back then because I was, I had to go to bed early, or just my brain just wasn't hardwired to read like, a 300-page book. So I was sticking to reading magazines and newspapers and clippings and stuff like that. So I made the intentional decision of like, I've got to try to better myself and do something that I'm going to enjoy. So the combination of me always wanting to get involved in sketch and improv, and me being intentional about like, I've got to do something. I've got to take a class for something, just because I can't just, it can't just all be the radio, because the radio show, and even though I loved the experience of it, was basically a 24/7 job. Like, even when I wasn't on the radio, I was thinking about content for the radio on the weekends. If there was news or a story that broke, I have to process that and make sure to be able to talk about it, discuss it, break it down on Monday morning. So I was always on and just needed something to turn off, because the one thing you learn on improv is it's important to live in the moment and get out of your head. Like, they talk about that all the time, get out of your head. And so I wanted to get out of my own head, signed up for these improv classes, and I really, really enjoyed it. I probably wasn't very good at it, but I really, really enjoyed it. And then so improv then went to sketch, which, if people don't know the difference, basically improv is the gateway drug to sketch comedy, because what essentially happens is you create premises when you're performing with a partner, but with sketch you're writing those premises and then blowing it up into a sketch. So I ended up falling in with a sketch comedy group, which was an accident. I was taking a bunch of classes at UCB, and when you sign up for these classes, everyone's on an email list. So you can email, hey, listen, you want to practice on Thursday, 5:00 before class? Yeah. So I was on this email list, and all of a sudden one of the guys in my group said, hey, listen, we're starting up this new sketch comedy group. It's called Express Lane, where we put on a show in 1 week. We write all the sketches Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then perform them on Friday. So I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. And they write me this letter, and they said, we're looking for actors. And, you're in their class. You seem like you know what you're doing. Do you want to be an actor? And I'm like, sure, I'm an actor. Yeah, of course. I've been doing improv. I've been taking improv classes for a year. Let me do that.
Why not?
Yeah. And of course,
I can run a marathon.
Sure, it's the same, right?
Yeah.
So I ended up joining this group, and we toured and played together for like 3 years. And it was and like I said, one of the things I did learn from the whole process of improv and sketch is just being able to get out of your own way. Because with improv, you have to live in the moment. And that's a big part of my book. It's a big part of like the conversations I have, is just get out of your own brain. You can't be thinking about something else when you're doing podcasting, or you're doing interviews, or you're having a real conversation with someone. I tell people, turn the phone off, have only one window open on your desktop. If it's a Zoom interview, just have that Zoom. Don't have all these things open. Have your phone nowhere near you where you could possibly be enticed to go check it out. Just live in the moment. Get out of your own head. And I think that's the problem with a lot of conversations. People are so stuck in their own head, not just about what they're going to ask the person, but they're also thinking about, oh, I'm hungry. What am I going to eat later? Oh, man.
Yeah.
They'll think about,
what am I going to make for dinner?
Yeah. All that stuff needs to be completely out of your brain, because it doesn't do justice for the person you're speaking to. And that was one of the things I accidentally learned in improv. I didn't realize that was one of the things I would learn in my training, was this idea of just like living in the moment and just getting out of your own way.
Yeah, it's actually one of the things that you learn in voiceover too. So coaches tell me that all the time. I mean, that's part of the training.
Yeah.
You're living in the manufactured moment someone else made.
Yeah. And it's so difficult because we're so distracted. It's so easily to be distracted that we have to be really focused on not being distracted. I just read the book by Johan Hari called Stolen Focus, how like tech companies are basically built to steal our focus. Like, we have low attention spans because of these platforms and hardware devices that were built. So if you can avoid those things while you're having a conversation or recording a podcast, you will be much better for it.
Yeah. And along those lines, I also wanted to ask you what you thought the most common problem was for podcasters that are interviewing people. And do you know how that could be fixed?
Yeah. One of the most common things, and it's funny we're talking about, is the editing. That's super common. Like, I feel like people don't edit enough during a podcast. There are so many times, and again, this is me coming from terrestrial radio where every second counted, and I know podcasting, you let things breathe, but I'll listen to a podcast where all of a sudden someone's dog starts barking like crazy, and they just keep going with the podcast. I'm like, just stop. There's that like stop button. Go ahead and stop that, and then continue. This is not like some sort of like giant massive wave on the coast of Hawaii that's going to come at you. You can press pause and stop, let things pass, and then continue. I know it's a very petty thing to argue about, but I think it's important because, especially if you are building a podcast audience, it's important to have this sort of air of professionalism. And I know a lot of podcasters really, really lean into like the organic, authentic nature of a podcast, and they don't mind it. And it's real life. I'm like, yeah, it's real life, but why would you want that's your real life. Why would you want people to be taken out of it? Because all I could think about when I hear a podcast where dogs are going crazy in the background, I'm like, what's wrong with that dog? Is that dog need to be fed? Is the dog injured? So why would you do that? Why would you distract the audience? It may not be distracting you, but it is really distracting the audience from the point of the conversation. So if I give any advice to any podcasters, I don't want you to Frankenstein your podcast where it's like there's edits every 10 seconds, which people can sometimes get caught up in, but just like edit the most obvious mistakes and clean things up. So And I'm telling you, this goes for, especially for the younger generation of podcasters or people just starting out, regardless of your age. It's like, as long as you sound professional, it's going to go a long way. Once you get down the road and become a podcast rock star, sure. If there's dogs barking in the background, by that point, people are like, oh, that's Jody's dog barking in the background. That's people will know who your dog is. But if you're like a nobody and the dog's barking, they're just thinking something's wrong with that dog.
Yeah, yeah. And sound is important. I think that people don't understand quite how important the sound being good in a podcast actually is. You can get away with that on radio because it's radio, but they're in a studio, right? And people should at least have a quiet space. Not be distracted, like you said, and actually have a separate mic and headphones. And, these things are really important. So, yeah.
Yeah. One of my pet peeves too, Jody, over the last couple of years is people like using Zoom for podcasting. And I tell people, Zoom was not made for podcasting. It's really not. It's a communication. It's like a telephone. It's a communication app. That's all. It's not made to record audio to be shared to hundreds of thousands of people. It's just not. I mean, it's nice to have that visual element when you're interviewing the person, but at the end of the day, the audio sounds awful. And I've heard so many really like good podcasters, like people who have like subscribers in the millions because they just either were too lazy or just didn't feel like finding another way of doing Zoom podcasts. And me being so like anal about it, I'm like, I just can't listen to that. It just,
it hurts my ears.
Yeah, it hurts my ears too. So you've got to make the experience. And remember, we've been talking about the experience that you want for your guests, but you also have to think about the experience for the audience. You want them to be able to be comfortable to hear something. And so anytime you can avoid like the dog barking or the bad quality of a Zoom interview, it's like there's ways around that are easily fixed that don't require like huge monetary investments or time investments. There's a lot of hacks you can do to make podcasts sound good. And again, not everyone's going to have their equipment. Like if you interview someone, not everyone's going to have a brand new Shure MV7 microphone or or they can have a Blue Yeti microphone. But, as long as that person has, say, a quiet room, you're using a pretty good recording platform in itself to actually execute the podcast, you can find hacks to work around like some people's inability to have the equipment that's necessary, because not everyone's going to have it. As much as we want to be like, oh, cool, like everyone's got a microphone. Not everyone does, but you've got to do work on your end to make it so that the sound is going to be professional sounding and it's going to make you sound good, because you don't want it to be like I was just talking about. Like, you don't want to be having someone pop on your podcast and then hear the audio and be like, I'm not listening to that. Click, next podcast. Because there's a lot of podcasts out there, Jody. I don't know if anyone's mentioned that to you.
There are a lot of them. Yes.
There's quite a few options. So you want to give people that option to listen to it because it sounds good.
Are you looking for ways to improve your company's or podcast's impact? You'd be surprised how powerful the use of an intentional audio branding strategy can be. Want to know more? I have a free downloadable PDF that gives you my 5 tips for implementing an intentional audio strategy at voiceoversandvocals.com/audio-branding-strategy. That location does ask to put you on a mailing list, just to send you updates on when the new podcasts come out. But if you really don't want to give your email out, I understand. Just contact me directly. My email is all over my website, and I'll make sure you get that PDF without needing to sign up anywhere. If you do sign up, though, you also get access to a resources section called The Studio, where I have videos, white papers, and PDFs, discounts from my guests, and snippets of audio from my guests that no one else gets to hear. So maybe it's worth your while. Totally up to you. And of course, if you're looking for voiceovers, you can get in touch with me about that too. Now, back to the podcast.
So what do you think makes a compelling podcast? Is it like the questions? Is it the answers? Yeah. Is it the sound?
Yeah. You know what I think is a compelling podcast? It's a podcast that doesn't sound like a podcast. And I know that's a really goofy answer, but if it sounds like 2 people talking or 3 people talking, and they're having this conversation that there's a genuine back and forth of information, that's what makes the best podcast. I always tell people, and this is something I learned from radio, if you prep 10 questions for an interview, if you use one of them, that means that was a good interview. And it for people to be like, well, that makes no sense. You only asked one of your questions. I'm like, no, it meant that you rode the wave. You took the conversation where it was supposed to go in a very organic manner. So that, to me, that's what makes a good podcast. And again, not everyone's going to know that you only prepared one question, but I'm just internalizing it. But but when that conversation happens where it seems like there was nothing prepared and it just happens, those are the best. That's those magic moments we're talking about. Those only happen because you're listening, you're giving people this safe space to communicate, and you're having this exchange of ideas that just sound like two people just talking.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. And it's hard to do, actually. I mean, you can ride the wave, definitely, but I think that all of us are sort of fighting ourselves to not be the only person who's the star of our story. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. But that's why listening's big. Yeah, Jody, that's why listening is such a big part of it, because
exactly.
if your guest is giving you things that you didn't plan on talking about, take those gifts and use those, and then forget everything that you've prepared to talk about, unless there's like some major thing at the end of the interview, be like, oh, hey, listen, before we wrap things up, I really got to ask you this question. But as long as you're able to have this conversation where it just feels like it's just a conversation. That's going back to what I was talking about earlier. Just when it feels like a conversation, not an interview, that's great content. That's great audio content, because it just is real. It just happened, and we captured it on some sort of technical device that records our sound, and then we're able to fix it up later, and then we share it to the world instantly. That's pretty freaking awesome.
It is. Yeah. I wanted to ask you before we end this, because we're coming up on the end here, and I want to be respectful of your time. You are releasing your book soon, right? So
yes, yeah.
Is that what you're working on now? Is there more than that, or you can talk about the book? Definitely.
Absolutely, yeah. So the book is available for pre-order now. I'm not sure when you listen to this, but if you search Good Listen on any of your favorite bookstores, Amazon, Google, Barnes & Noble, Apple Books, readily available, and you can also buy it on paperback and ebook. And so that's what I'm working on now. And I just recorded the audiobook, which Jody, have you done audiobooks before?
I have not, and there is a reason. So I can imagine how difficult that was.
Yes. We'll talk about like hating the sound of your voice. At the end of an audiobook, you will despise the sound of your voice.
Yeah.
People don't realize like how difficult, and the people that run like the producers of audiobooks, man, they are some tough nuts, man. Because if you read for example, like if you read in the audiobook, you say like, you are not there, and you say you're not there. They're like, no. You've got to say that over. The book says you are not there, not you're there. So
it's really, even if it's like your own book?
Absolutely. You have to do it exactly to the audiobook has to be exact to what's in print. So and I've done audiobooks for other people, and it's really, really hard when it's not your voice. When I was doing mine, it was like, oh, this is cool. It's me. It's my voice. But like when you do other people, and I'm sure your voice work, it's like, it's really hard to try to take someone else's words and make them sound natural. And that is really tough thing to do.
That's the training. That's what we get coaching for. Yes.
Absolutely. So,
easier when it's your own voice.
Totally. Especially your words too. I think that's like, if it's written in your own language, it's like we all have our own language of how we communicate. So it makes it a lot easier. So it's also available on audiobook. But I always tell people, when people are like, hey, should I do an audiobook version? I'm like, make sure you're very, very patient and have a lot of time, because depending how long I think most audiobooks are like, 10 to 20 hours of actual audio when it's finished. That's the finished version. That's not all the stops and starts and redos you have to do later.
Oh, yeah.
So
add another 4 times on that.
Yeah. It's a huge, huge, huge time suck. So Good Listen, available on all platforms. And then I've got the podcast I do with Forbes Books. It's Forbes Books Audio. You could just search on any podcast platform, where I interview CEOs and entrepreneurs and just have conversations about how they built their business and how they become leaders. It's funny because I came from this world of interviewing like musical celebrities and TV and movie stars, and then into the world of business where I make a living now. But it's not that different. Like, it's funny. It's not that different talking to a music artist as opposed to a CEO, because all the things we've been talking about in this podcast today, Jody, they all apply. No matter what the content is, at the end of the day, it's just a conversation, and you can't overthink it. I've had these podcasts where I will start not even having any idea what this person does for a living, like in terms of like how it works, like how their company makes money. Like, I'm not a business brain, so I can't. I don't have any MBAs. I don't even have a BA. My brain doesn't work in that world. But I use these conversations to have these people inform me in how it works. How do their business work? How do they work as leaders? And like I said, it's all just about having a conversation with people and getting them to talk and letting them talk and sharing their story with you. And then you feeding back your own take on things. And that's what works. So me interviewing Bruno Mars is no different from me interviewing the CEO of Build-A-Bear. It's all the same thing.
Sure. Yeah. And just being curious, I guess, is part of that, because that makes you interested in asking the questions that maybe your audience might like to hear.
Yeah. And you have to care. I mean, I used the word care before. Like, you really have to care.
It's important.
Because if you don't care, it's just like question, answer. It's like you don't. But if you're really curious and care about other people, and again, it's all about self-awareness, knowing what other people are feeling, knowing what people are going through. If that is the kind of human being you are, you will be a good podcaster. You will be able to create audio moments that will live on and on. And one of the things I like to tell people is, like, the great thing about podcasts is you put your podcast out there, it's out there for eternity. Like, it is going to be out there forever. So make sure you're proud of it. And if you are, it's like, cool. 20 years from now, someone might hear this podcast and be like, hey, that Joe Pardavila, he seemed like a really nice guy. He died in that horrible plane crash, but man, we have this podcast conversation where you and Jody share the importance of conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Let's hope that's not what they're saying 20 years from now.
No.
I'd really hope not.
Yeah, same here, Jody. I was just using it as an example of what could happen in the future. Yeah.
So how can people get a hold of you if they would like to do that?
Easily accessible, Jody. I'm Joe Pardavila on pretty much all social media platforms: LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter. Those are my three favorites. I'm not a big Facebook person. I've kind of tried to work my way out of the Zuckerberg world, even though I'm still on Instagram. But that's so mindless, is posting a photo of stuff. But feel free to reach out to me, contact me. I'm all about, like, if people have want advice, not that I like to delve advice, but I can just share what I've been through, and that's sort of like the whole reasoning for the book. It's just like, hey, listen, here's what I went through. Hopefully this stuff will help you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I know that we probably could have gone another hour, but yeah, thank you so much. This is really great.
Thanks, Jody. Thanks for having me.
Well, that's the end of this episode. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you heard, why not tell a friend about this podcast? It's available in all the usual locations. Until next time.